Welcome back to Things That Are Harder. This is a reimagining of a video that I made during Joplin development about my thoughts about cities. One thing you need to reach a consensus on in your game is, what do you even mean by a city? In the 8th, 9th, 10th century, there were cities with hundreds of thousands at various points in time, over 1 million people. Do you mean that? You might, because you might be going to the capital of an empire or a major glittering city of intellectuals and magic. In which case, when you say city, you mean big city. On the other hand, when you say city, you might mean something that's the equivalent of the capital of a small country in the 10th century. In which case, you might be talking something in the 10 or 20,000 range. But remember, 20,000 is still a lot. If you stand 10,000 people shoulder to shoulder, they still are going to fill your area up pretty densely. So to sell a city, you're talking about something pretty big. Often what you see representing a city in a game is really more of a village. It might be a few hundred people. And depending on your setting and the realities of your game, that might be fine. There is an interesting theory about Skyrim that everything is essentially 10 times smaller than is presented. So when you run a distance, imagine that it's 10 times further. When you meet a person, imagine there were 10 people. And if you scale up their cities by a factor of 10, yeah, you can start to see that maybe these are cities. And certainly you're kind of in a provincial backwater in Skyrim, so okay, kind of buy it. Those cities are not one-to-one representations because the total number of people in their cities simply do not correctly represent a city. Nor do you necessarily want to, because most of the people in a city have nothing to offer the player of your game. There are some good games out there that tackle cities. Right now, I think the state of the art for fantasy RPGs might still be The Witcher 3, and it does a pretty good job of a continuous city. But I'm going to argue that maybe that's not the right approach. Okay, so let's look at a city. So here is a map of Algiers from 1560 sometime. So not really exactly the sort of medieval context of a fantasy game, but pretty close. But let's just zoom in on that. So think about the way that you live in a city, assuming you live in a city, because your players aren't people living in a medieval city. Your players are mostly people living in modern cities. So they have a modern interaction with the city. So let's look at cities through that lens. So let's say you live here on the west side of the city, and every day you go to work over here and you travel back and forth between those two locations quite often. And then once in a while you go over here to go to the market and buy some groceries. And you have two different paths that you take. You take this way when you're going there from your house, but also sometimes you go to or from the way to work. So you kind of cut through over here. Additionally, sometimes you go down to the docks to pick up some fish, and you have a common path that you take to go there. And finally, your brother lives on the other side of town, and once a month you go over for dinner, but you always take this one path to get there. So does this mean that you know this city? You've been to most corners of the city. Well, I'm going to argue that you barely know this city at all. Well, first of all, you don't really know the parts outside of the walls at all. Can't see them. You don't go there. You largely live your life within the city. And then these other parts of the city where you don't travel with any regularity, I mean, they exist kind of, but you certainly don't know what's in these different buildings. You have a sort of vague understanding of the different parts of town. And then even closer in, you don't really leave the path on your daily travels, do you? You drive past these buildings. You may have a rough idea that the sporting goods store is there on the road you take, but if you've never stopped and gone in there, do you really know what that is? And even really the path that you travel itself, you're just whizzing along in a car. So you don't really even have an understanding of that, do you? Again, this is through the lens of most of our experiences in cities these days, where we're either driving a car between two destinations or we're taking a train or a bus, again, between two destinations. We don't really have an experience of the path between those 2 points. Now, I'm certainly showing my bias here living in a city like Edmonton, which is very car-centric, but I do think that this still applies to more walkable cities in Europe and Asia and even parts of North America. You still tend to move between centers of activity through some sort of rapid quick travel methodology. In the case of more walkable cities, your centers of activity may be larger. You may understand the space around you a bit better. As maybe a consequence of that, you may have fewer of them. But I do think that what we're talking about here still makes sense, even in a city where walkability is taken into account by the city planners. Now, what might happen is one day you're driving to your brother's house and then there is a car accident and you are stuck here along the path for a few hours waiting for a tow truck. Well, when that happens, then that fog starts to draw back a little bit because maybe you explore a little and you look around and you learn a little bit about a new place. So a new place opens up in your understanding of a city. Let me try to make this argument one other way. Now, this part of the argument was a lot easier to make when I was making it in the Bioware offices. Remember when we used to work in offices and everyone had the same view out of their window, so you could use the window from the building we were in to make this next point. But I'm going to make it anyway. This is a piece of stock footage. So let's say you work in this building that we're looking out of the window of. Do you know what's in here? Well, chances are you might. You can see the sign if it had one. That might be the coffee shop you go to every day. What about this store over here? Do you know what that is? Yeah, again, probably. What about this one? You're getting a little bit less certain. What about this one further back? And I could draw this even further back, going more than a block away. And I suspect once we get more than a block or two away from your view, you don't know what's in that building. You don't know even on the base level what store is there. Do you even know what store is here in the building that you're in? Now, given that you're already feeling a little uncertain, do you know who these people are? They're working late. Do you know what they're up to? Probably not. Certainly not these people over here. So the thesis here, the argument I'm making is that for a modern person, your experience of a city is more about little clusters of engagement connected by tiny little tubes of movement, where occasionally you get effectively a random encounter along the way that introduces you to another part of the city. I actually think if you go back to 2009 to Dragon Age Origins, its implementation of Denerim is very much what I'm talking about. It has important locations that you go to that are fairly small, that you understand and interact with and have interesting things to do, but the rest of the city is largely not there, except once in a while you get a random encounter and some bandits jump out at you and flesh out the rest of the city. And I think given our modern interaction with cities, this is actually a more realistic implementation of cities. Because why are cities more difficult than you think? Well, a city, even a medieval city, even a small city from a fantasy setting, should have more than 10,000 people in it. But those people are not interesting people for your protagonist. So to do it accurately, you end up having an incredible amount of content that doesn't really serve that much purpose. It's all just set dressing. Better to make a city that is even grander in scale, but you only realize the interesting parts of it and leave the backdrop and dressing to be established and filled in by the UI and by the player's own imagination, because they don't want to knock on every single door and break into every single place where people live. That's not interesting gameplay. These people don't own anything. Rather, they want to interact with the interesting people in your environment. Cities are different than an area like the hinterland, hinterlands because their population density is so high that you cross a threshold and players' expectations change. They actually don't expect to interact with most people in the environment. They just expect them to essentially be walking, talking chairs. So you can actually approach them in a different way than other content in your game. In an area like the hinterlands, which is this sort of medium population density, you expect every person to matter. In an area like the hissing waste with very low population density, you expect every person to really matter. But in a city, you know that most of these people are just going about their lives, and every single person you cross in the street isn't going to have a quest to give you. So I know this isn't the way that games are necessarily going to approach cities going forward. Indeed, I'm going to suggest that your approach should depend on a bunch of different things. How many different cities you have, how big those cities are, how important of a character each of those cities is in your setting. And based upon those things and others, you can decide what approach to take with how you implement your city. Because every city is an abstraction of some sort. But I do think that when you look at cities through the eyes of a modern city dweller, you realize that actually this sort of old-fashioned way of thinking about the urban environment is actually more accurate to the way we experience cities these days, and might give us some opportunities to explore urban gameplay in a new and interesting way. A special thanks to my members. They help keep this channel running. If you are interested in becoming a member, there's a link down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. That will help the YouTube algorithm understand that it's interesting and potentially share it with more people. What games do you think have great cities? Let me know about that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.